Hello and welcome to the Republic of Azo. I am your host, Zach Yost. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Lauren Hall of the Rochester Institute of Technology, who is joining us to talk about a wide array of exciting subjects, including her work on the family, the special upcoming issue of Cosmos and Taxis that she is editing, and also her exciting new project on Substack looking at radical moderation. Dr. Hall is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the College of Liberal Arts at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where she was the former chair of political science. She is the author of The Medicalization of Birth and Death and Family in the Politics of Moderation, and the co-editor of a volume on the political philosophy of French political thinker Chantal Delceau. She has written extensively on the classical liberal tradition, including articles on Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, and Montesquieu. She serves on the editorial board of the interdisciplinary journal Cosmos and Taxis, which publishes on spontaneous orders in the social and political worlds. And her current research is on the moral and political implications of regulations, as well as issues relating to gender and the family. So stay tuned for an exciting conversation. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm here with Lauren Hall, who, as I just explained, participated in the panel at Markets and Society that we covered in a previous episode. And thanks so much for being here today, Lauren.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So there's so many things we want to cover today. And let's just dive in, I suppose. In 2014, you published the book Family in the Politics of Moderation, which I can't recommend highly enough. I love that book. It influenced my own way of thinking a lot. And I found it it covered a lot of things that people, I'd say, in our sphere don't cover a lot, especially mentioning Burke and whatnot. So just to start off, I forgot to look it up, but where did you study? Were you in sort of a more political theory-oriented program?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
Yeah, I studied political theory at Northern Illinois University.
Okay. Is that what your degree's in? Political theory, or is it technically something else?
It's technically political science, but political theory was my first field. Yeah.
Okay, great. I dropped out of CUA's political theory program, so but glad to see it's not doing so well, I suppose, but glad there are people still around doing that. So one of the main things I wanted to talk about was how you frame family as a moderating force between extreme individualism and collectivism. So if you could just expand on that some.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things going on, and my thinking on this has expanded a little bit since I wrote the book. But what I was really trying to understand is the way that the family as a social institution, and in fact is one of the sort of the primary institutions in human life, sort of operates as a kind of fulcrum between the claims of communities and the claims of individuals. And it does that in a pretty obvious sort of way, right? Like, it's really hard to be sort of a really hardcore, radical, individualist sort of, I use the term atomic families, but the sort of the really extreme versions of individualism when you're forced to live with other human beings in really close proximity. But the other thing that the family does that sort of softens the edges of individualist thinking is the role that the affections play. And this is where Burke comes in, right? So Burke has this wonderful discussion where he talks about the importance of the affections and and prejudices too, but he uses the term prejudices in a different way than we use it now. in sort of tying us to, or rather, another way of putting it is softening the edges of rights claims, right? So it's really easy for an individual to say, like, I have this right to free speech, I have this right to property, I have this right to X, Y, or Z. And Burke's point is, yes, that's true. But those rights have to be made compatible with other human beings. And the easiest way that they become compatible is if people voluntarily make them compatible, right? I can force them to be compatible in all sorts of ways and have all sorts of legal machinations. But the easiest way is for me to say, oh, I have a right to X and my partner has a right to Y, and because we care about each other, let's figure out a way to make these rights claims work together. And so the family, I think, assists in that process of sort of softening the edges of rights claims, because it's a human institution bound together by affection, as opposed to consent, right? I mean, consent is part of it, but it's not all of it. So that's sort of the individualist piece, and then the collectivist piece, I think, is really clear too, which is that really radical collectivism doesn't work well with the family, because the affections that we have for our unique and particular family members pull us away from the collective, the broader collective, in really clear kinds of ways. And so if you look at the history of sort of really sort of extreme collective thought, they have to get rid of the family one way or the other. And that's usually the first thing that they do. So I was trying to sort of look at the history of political thought via this lens of the family. And I found that in general, the political theorists who take the family seriously end up in a more moderate kind of space than the political theorists who say, let's get rid of this thing altogether because it's violating our political principles.
Yeah, I like your contrast between Ayn Rand and Marx.
Mm-hmm.
And when I interviewed Jason Jewell a little while ago, and he pointed out that Ayn Rand's sort of utopia civilization in Galt's Gulch, there's like one family.
There's one kid, yeah.
Yeah, so he's like, that society is going to go extinct. And so it's something that she left out, and that a lot of libertarian thinkers seem to just miss the ball on. I mean, part of it also is so many prominent libertarians never had any kids. I think probably plays some role in that.
Mm-hmm.
Ayn Rand didn't, and I just not interestingly, Hayek did have kids, and he was sort of much more, I would say, open to the stuff you're talking about. And in what way have you mentioned your thinking has evolved a little bit? How would you say it's changed some since the book came out?
Well, I think I've thought a little more deeply about the human development piece, and that didn't really fit in with the book when I wrote it anyway, because the book was really a sort of primarily political theory book.
Mhm.
And now I've started thinking a little bit more about, and this was some of what I did in the Markets and Society talk, and I've just sort of been playing with these ideas a little bit more. But there's a lot of really interesting social psychology research and just developmental psychology research on the importance of really early childhood development. So libertarians, I think, for a lot of reasons, focus on children once they've reached the age of reason, right? So, whatever that is, anywhere from 7 if you're in the Catholic Church to, I don't know, like 12 or 16, right? People disagree, sort of, but once you reach sort of the age of being able to think about and consent to various kinds of contracts and agreements, that's kind of where libertarians get interested. But my concern is that we're actually missing the boat in a really big way, because actually where the groundwork for that kind of rational thinking is laid is much, much earlier. So really between the ages of like infancy and age 3 is where your brain is laying down the foundation for your ability to cooperate, your ability to trust, your ability to reciprocate. And so I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the conditions of really early childhood. And there's some really interesting libertarian thinkers who are in this area. So Andrew Jason Cohen does a lot of work on, or at least has done some work on parental licensure from a libertarian perspective, in part because parents have this enormously determinative effect on their children's outcomes when it comes to their capacity to become rational and engaged citizens in the way that libertarians would like to think sort of happens naturally, right? So I think libertarians need to spend a lot more time thinking about early childhood development, which is sort of funny because they just don't think
Yeah.
about that at all. And that's just off the radar for the vast majority of libertarians. And the reason it is, right, is that it's really hard. Like it's that area where, and this is another thing that I try to lay out in the book, is that the family makes a mess of ideological
Mhm.
sort of positions, generally speaking. And so when you get into early childhood, libertarians get really uncomfortable because they want to say something like, well, the parents are sort of, like children are sort of
Yeah.
property-ish of the parents at that point. And so really the state shouldn't intervene, unless there's force or fraud, but then how you define that is really sort of unclear. And so it's just a really hard case, right? It's really hard to know when, because the state, when it does intervene, often does a lot of really bad stuff. So it's not like we have good solutions or easy solutions to how to protect young, vulnerable children from parents who either can't or won't do the kinds of things that are needed for those children to develop into healthy, rational individualists, right? And so I understand why libertarians shy away from it, because it's like just a really hard area. But we need more people thinking in this space, and there are some people who I think are getting into that space. The philosopher Jess Flanagan does some work on parenthood and motherhood. Jason Kuznicki has done some work in this, or has at least done some thinking in this area. And then I mentioned Andrew Jason Cohen. So I think there's people moving into this space in really interesting ways, but there just isn't a lot of mainstream, or maybe any. And then of course Steve Horowitz's wonderful book Hayek's Modern Family, which I really strongly recommend, is a beautiful look at the family. But other than those folks, I don't see a lot of movement.
Yeah, and in your talk at Marxists and Society, I remember you mentioned a book that about coyotes. Well, not about coyotes, but what was that book?
Oh, I love that book. Yeah, it's Wild Justice by Mark Bekoff and Jessica Pierce. And she's a philosopher, and he is a canid animal behaviorist, or he just studies canids, which includes coyotes. And I love that book because it through sort of studying various kinds of animals. It's not just coyotes. There's like a chapter that looks at elephants and all this other stuff. But really what they're looking at in that book is the moral lives of animals. They're looking at sort of how animals learn moral rules, how they think about these questions of reciprocity and trust, and how and the reason he focuses on coyotes is that because they're social hunters, they need an enormous amount of pack cohesion to survive. And so you need a pretty intense, thick morality to have that kind of system work. And anyway, and it's just a really wonderful read for anyone who's in that space. And the fact that it's written with Pierce is a philosopher, and Bekoff is an animal behaviorist, you get some really, really neat insights that I think you wouldn't get with a single authored piece in that same way.
And so another point you touch on in the book is sort of how family is an unchosen sort of association. We don't choose what families we're born into, and that sort of rubs us the wrong way in today's sort of ethos. And I don't know if you ever read Unheard, but they recently had a piece that made me think of your book. It was about Harry and Meghan and everything. And it just had this line that I thought was pretty good. We all come from somewhere, rooted in a place layered by generations of expectations, and the moral call of such expectations cannot be escaped from simply by relocating to California. So if you want to talk some about sort of these unchosen associations that come with the family, but also sort of how it seems that we have some sort of we're in like a weird situation where uh, even when people want to try and live up to these sort of familial obligations and things, it's sort of odd because everyone is operating on this individualist framework. So it can sort of be very disjointed, I suppose.
Hmm. Yeah, this has been a pretty interesting sort of. I think our modern culture really has moved in the direction of kind of pretty radical consent, right? You don't like your parents, you can divorce them. You don't like your partner, you can divorce that person, right? There's I've seen just like a lot of an increase in stories about um, child estrangement, right, from
Mhm,
parents
mhm.
as kids just decide that this relationship is too messy. Um, and what interests me about those accounts is that, sure, to a certain degree, you can do that. Like you can decide that your parents aren't going to be part of your life anymore. And my position here is certainly not that you should keep like really toxic people
Mhm.
around. That's not my argument. But my argument, I think, is a more subtle one, which is at some point though, you just can't get rid of those people and the effects that they had on your life. And this is where the unchosen part comes in. So, whatever I think at the age of 40 about my childhood and my parents, they are largely responsible for the kind of person I am right now. In the sense that their genes are my genes, right? I don't get to like reject the genes that if I could do that, I would have a much faster metabolism and much less depression, right? Like this is just how like genes are hard things. So I don't get to choose the genes that I have. I don't get to choose the early childhood experiences I had, and I actually had a wonderful family, so I don't have the same, I think, discomfort
Mhm,
that
mhm.
other people have. But I'm very sympathetic to the desire to get rid of some of this baggage, but I'm also very aware of the impossibility of that, of actually doing that in any kind of real way, right? So that's where I think the family is pretty interesting from a philosophical perspective, is that, we want to think that we are sort of self-created beings,
Right,
but
yeah.
really we're not. And so and so that, I think, there, and even so, for example, if you look at divorce, right, I mean, divorce is in fact, I think, a pretty important um social idea, but it's not like divorce erases the marriage or erases your experiences or erases that past, right? And so I think we're sort of, the way that we talk about are sort of choosing our families. It's almost like that movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where like people keep trying to erase traumatic or like difficult memories and just can't quite do it. So I think we live in a kind of interesting fiction where we want to claim a certain kind of freedom that we have at baseline that just doesn't exist in practice. And the family is probably the best example of that, right? Like you can cast off your parents, but they're still part of you, in a way that for many people is really hard to contend with. And then to your point, of the sort of generational effects, that goes even deeper, right? And I think you see that most clearly where I've been thinking a lot recently about these friction points, like almost like tectonic plates where they like rub together. And I think you see the generational effects more clearly when you start getting shifts, cultural shifts between generations. And so you'll see people, for example, talking to parents or grandparents from more traditional cultures, and there's a kind of weight that those older kinds of the older family members, but also the more traditional cultures, have on these people who are living in very modern worlds and very modern lives. There's still this kind of like interesting drag. And part of what I think is fascinating about that too is that Burke talks about that, right? So this is Burke's, the sort of weight of tradition
Mhm,
is
mhm.
part of this intergenerational compact. And so part of my thinking about the family has been trying to understand how the intergenerational compact works in practice. So what is it that I owe my grandparents who are
Yeah.
now all dead? Um, and obviously from a libertarian perspective, I don't owe them anything practical, but I do feel a sense of debt to the work that they put in this country to become the people that they became, to provide the kinds of opportunities that I was able to take advantage of. And then the corresponding duty is, what do I owe to the future? What do I owe to my children and grandchildren? And that is where I think it becomes really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of like it can be difficult trying to exhibit filial piety, basically, when the infrastructure for doing so is sort of not really present. It's easier to take care of, family elders when there's like 15 grandchildren versus when
Mhm.
there's like two or one or, not many at all. So I think that's sort of a hard going into the future. That's just going to be a rough thing to deal with, I think.
Well, and there's also some really interesting examples of our modern culture being actively antagonistic toward those kinds of claims. My next door neighbors were trying to put on an in-law suite to take care of, because they struggled with the 2 years of COVID restrictions on their elderly
Mhm.
parents, and so they said, "Well, let's just build an addition. We'll move them in with us, and they're very bonded with their grandson. So let's just try to do this." And the town was so worried about them renting it out as an Airbnb that they put all of these crazy restrictions on it to prevent a multi-generational living arrangement. And so I think we've just it's almost like foreign to us now that you would want to have a home where you could have parents living independently with you. Whereas in large parts of the world, that's just how homes are constructed. And so it's kind of interesting that like even in something as like odd as like zoning law or housing
Yeah.
policy actually make it really hard for people um to engage in anything other than the sort of basic nuclear family kinds of interactions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one last thing before we move on. What are your thoughts on the state of the family today? I mean, we sort of touched on that some, but especially like millennial marriage rates are so awful. I mean, I'm 29 and I'm like it's a historical aberration that I'm not married, but it's perfectly normal now. And I mean, it seems potentially, and there's going to be like an unprecedented amount of people who never get married, never have kids. It seems not good. So what are your thoughts on the state of things right now and where they're headed?
Yeah, I'm again sort of I take a kind of moderate position on this. And part of it's that, you know, family life is hard. It takes a lot. I have 3 kids. I have 3 young kids. I have an active work life, a job that I really love. And having a lot of things in your life that you care deeply about that are really important is just hard to balance. Like that's just life, right? So I understand why people are shying away from those kinds of thick attachments and those kinds of thick responsibilities. I do think it's a loss. I mean, I think I lean pro-natalist when it comes to really thinking about what future societies are going to look like. And I think we've done something really weird in terms of the panic over overpopulation really pushed a lot of well-meaning people into sort of bizarre decisions, right? Because the actual evidence on overpopulation is that it just is not that big of a problem, right? And in fact, that birth rates decline as education rises, and there's just a pretty natural cycle to this kind of thing. But now what we're really looking at is the birth rate cliff, right? And if you don't have people replacing themselves, you have some pretty serious problems downstream. And there's a demographer named Lyman Stone, and he had a really interesting. I was at a talk, or I was giving a talk out at Sacramento State with him and Jess Flanagan and some other folks, and Lyman made the point, which I think is pretty interesting, which is that people are only going to innovate for the future if it's worth it to do so, and being worth it requires there to be a population to use that innovation. And so his point, which I think is pretty interesting, is if we really want to tackle um, issues like climate change or various kinds of other serious threats, um, there's got to be a population that innovators can see coming to care enough about it to sort of like entrepreneurs have to think it's worthwhile, right? So I I guess I'm concerned about sort of the birth rate stuff a little bit. And not to the point though that I think we need to like force people into having kids, because having
Oh,
kids is a
yeah.
huge responsibility, right? So this is the tension. In terms of the status of the family overall, I don't think we're in a great place, but I tend to avoid sort of catastrophic thinking on this ground in general, because human family forms have always been very flexible, very variable, and pretty diverse. So I think as long as kids are able to, as long as there are kids and they're being raised by, people who care about them, and are committed to them, whatever that looks like, I think we'll be okay.
Mhm.
I do think there's various kinds of things that I would like to see more of in our society. I think I'd like to see um, more support for young families in the form of, voluntary kinds of neighborhood association. And I actually see some of the stuff coming back after COVID. Um, but it is hard. I do think that, the current population, the current, sort of younger population, does feel a kind of existential despair about a lot of things, from the economy to climate change to, their own sort of individual capacity for, self-fulfillment. And that makes it really hard to commit to something like children, because kids are pretty hard, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's a pretty complicated space
Right.
right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a useful perspective. I do think it's sort of like the idea of having children is intimidating and whatnot. And I think that, but at least what I think in terms of like, I would like to have a family one day and whatnot is like my great great grandfather, who was an immigrant here. He had 10 kids. He was a janitor at a Catholic school. I was in the tiny house where the family, raised. I mean, this house that my family lives in now is larger, and even just further back, I mean, like hunter gatherers raised kids. I mean, so it's
Hmm.
sort of like we humanity is muddled through. We can probably handle it today with all the resources and whatnot we have at our disposal.
Yeah, and I'll just add one final thing. I think there's a really interesting, and this could be a subject for someone else to do research on, but I think there's a perception, bias going on, where I do think people right now think the world is fundamentally worse than it's ever been, that it's, that they're
Yeah.
living in these situations of like deep precarity. And I do think that they're convinced that they will leave children in a worse off place than they're in right now, which is already kind of bad. But the reality just doesn't really support that narrative. And so it is, I don't know what you do with a generation that really does have this perception that the world is kind of awful. And why would you bring kids into that? And this, I think, is, you see this with really dramatic rising rates of anxiety and depression among young
Mhm.
people. And as a college professor, I've seen this really dramatically just in the last 10 years, just absolute skyrocketing rates of anxiety. So I don't know what you do with that, because I do think that the success of family the success of families, broadly speaking, the success of marriages, the desire to get into a marriage, the desire to just, form stable partnerships, whether you care about marriage or not, um, relies on a certain baseline sort of security in who you are, and what you're doing. And I guess I am really worried about the sort of just generalized anxiety that current
Mhm.
generations have. So
Yeah. Um, so moving on, but still pretty related to what we're talking about. You're editing upcoming edition of Cosmos and Taxis with the theme of gender and emergent order. And that sounds pretty interesting. I'll link the description and whatnot, but if you want to explain what's that looking like it's going to cover, and just what people can expect in this issue.
yeah, so we actually just got back from a wonderful paper workshop on this issue in Atlanta, and I'm really, really excited about all of the submissions. It's a pretty neat range. So you have, there's some interesting sort of, kind of transhumanist approaches to thinking about how modern technology might allow us much more fluidity when it comes to gender and gender expression and gender identity, and thinking about what that means for, um, for sort of life moving forward. There's some really exciting work that folks are doing in the area of gender entrepreneurship. So looking at the role that markets play in allowing greater facility when it comes to gender entrepreneurship. And by gender entrepreneurship, they really mean sort of ways of looking for sort of openings, like places that you can be innovative and contribute to new understandings of gender identity. And so that paper, for example, looked at the original, or no, it wasn't that paper. It was another one that was also looking at sort of markets and gender, but looking at, for example, the role of gay bars as spaces to come together and engage in a certain kind of gender entrepreneurship, but also looking at the way that the market facilitated those kinds of spaces. So if you didn't have free markets, you were certainly not going to have a diverse enough landscape where people could create these kinds of safe spaces for themselves when the rest of the society was so hostile. So I think that'll be really fascinating. There's a couple, there's a really cool paper that looks at sort of women's property rights in during times of sort of cultural change. And so like, and they're using Victorian novels to sort of look at how cultural clashes between sort of British and American understandings of women's property rights sort of demonstrated this really interesting shift in how women thought about marriage and the family. So overall, I think it's going to be, and there's a couple other really good ones, and I don't want anyone to think that just because I can't think about them off the top of my head, they're not awesome. I'm really excited about the special issue. I think one of my reasons for putting out the call for that issue was that I thought, there's all sorts of really interesting work in political theory on specific thinkers, and but we haven't done as much on some of the really sort of hot button ideas, and thinking about ways to take those conversations in a more interesting and more nuanced direction than the basic sort of hot button like media takes, right?
Yes.
And so like, you can get all bound up in gender stuff if you just read the news. But what I really was hoping to get, and what I think I got from this call, was a lot of really serious scholars who have been thinking about issues of gender and emergent order for years, but just hadn't either had, now some of them have actually been publishing in this area for a really long time. So Jamie Lemke is in there. Sarah Squire has done a lot of work in this area. Michaela Novak. So actually people have been doing work in this space, but I don't think we've brought it into a single journal volume yet. So anyway, yeah, I'm pretty excited about what that's going to look like, and I think we'll see a pretty nice range. Oh, the other one that I think is really really neat is an economist who's doing a sort of qualitative work on women who have very large families, and so she's actually trying to look at how why women make those kinds of decisions, and how they see their own story, which is very different from the way that they're portrayed in the media, right? Which is like, oh, these crazy people who are sort of religious nuts or something like that. And in fact, it's a pretty nuanced and very very kind of fascinating, and there's an emergent thread in terms of how your identity as a mother sort of changes you and changes over time, within just your own lifetime. So I think there's a bunch of really interesting perspectives, some pretty diverse perspectives. And we hope that the edition will come out, so everyone got their feedback, and then the goal is to have it out this summer, the final edition.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds like it'll be very interesting, because as you said, most discourse around it seems to be, Twitter level, yelling and whatnot, memeing, and so I think even if people disagree with some of the contents and whatnot, it'll be useful just to have it all laid out there in a reasonable and not inflammatory way, I would say. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I'm excited to do, and I've sort of I poked the contributors in this direction too, is I really wanted everyone to sort of lay out some areas, because I think all of us see this as a starting point, not I don't
Hmm.
think any of us have any like conclusions to draw, but it's really clear that we need more research in this area. And so part of what I hope this volume does is or the special issue rather, is encourages grad students and independent scholars and all sorts of other people to identify some of the holes in the literature, and then see if they can start filling it. And that I think will be the most useful part of it, because you need sometimes you need these kinds of things to spur the areas where really smart people can then really get involved.
Yeah,
So
and the point about the paper on large families made me think of what we were just talking about with sort of like the anxiety and existential dread and how that affects people having children. And it's quite a contrast to look at Amish families where, like,
mhm.
I think the average Amish woman has like 7 kids, and Amish populations have like dramatically lower levels of anxiety and depression than society at large and all that sort of stuff. So I think yeah, it's definitely a factor there. So moving on, I wanted to talk about your most recent book, Medicalization of Birth and Death, which I'm not very familiar with, other than I think I've just read a few things here and there. But it definitely is something that I think is quite relevant, both in sort of as we have an aging population and whatnot, and sort of also with the existential dread we've just been talking about, how we approach death and things like that. So I'm just, if you could tell us what the gist is, basically.
Yeah. So I actually wrote that book, or when I started doing research on that book, I should say. It was really a reaction to my own experiences giving birth and my own experiences watching both of my grandparents die, and they actually had pretty good deaths by 21st century standards. They both died at home in hospice. They had very peaceful deaths. They were older. Um, but you had to work for it. Like my mom had to do an enormous amount of support work to make those deaths happen the way that they did and as peacefully as they did. And then my own births, I wanted non-medicalized births for a lot of reasons. And I was a low risk, otherwise healthy person. And what I was sort of fascinated by, and this was sort of the research puzzle that I started with, is like, why is it so hard to have an unmedicalized birth in the United States? Because so every single incentive in the system pushes you toward medicalization, and I found that that's the case with death too. So I originally actually thought it was going to be a book about culture. Like I was actually thinking that it was going to be more a sociology kind of volume than political theory. And it was a weird volume for me to write anyway, because I was sort of not trained in this area. So I was messing around in literatures that I was not as familiar with. And what I found is that as I was writing, the policy chapters just kept eating the rest of the book. And so I started thinking that it was really a sociological phenomenon, and then ended with a book about healthcare policy. And
Hmm.
it turns out that the reason that that we medicalize birth and death in these really harmful ways, and I'll just back up and say, I'm not against medicalization in like appropriate medicalization. You know,
Hmm.
my children have survived childhood so far. They haven't succumbed to scarlet fever. They don't have smallpox. I'm really in favor of the modern medical establishment for stuff like that. Where I think it's much more complicated is in areas of human life that are not inherently medical. So birth is not inherently medical. It can have medical complications, but most women have given birth without medical assistance in the course of human evolution, and that's just how like human life has operated. Um, and similarly, while death obviously has, like, especially terminal illness has medical components, a lot of death is actually just a psychological process, it's a physiological process, it's a process that your body has to move through. And a lot of the interventions that we give to people makes that process worse. It makes it more painful. It can actually even like hasten it in weird ways. and it makes it more psychologically painful for the people left behind. So my question was sort of like, let's take a look at what's going on. And what I really found is that it's about the incentives that are baked into the system. So the way that Medicare is structured, the way that Medicaid is structured, the way that our liability system is really sort of keyed up to encourage interventions to avoid liability. And so I was actually pretty surprised by the way that the book ended up because it was not the book that I thought I was going to write when I first started writing. And so part of what I hoped to do with that book was provide a path for healthcare reform that I mean, I don't actually think anyone is talking about healthcare reform in the way that it needs to be discussed. Because what a lot of people point to is, well, obviously we just need single payer healthcare, right? Like that's all, that would simplify all these things. Well, but the problem is that there's like very real problems with Medicaid and Medicare as they're structured now. So if you're just talking about adding more people to an already broken system, that doesn't seem to be the case, or it doesn't seem to be a good answer. Now, it's certainly true that we have to find a way to protect people from, medical bankruptcy. Like we've got to find a way to protect people from the unavoidable and really catastrophic costs associated with serious medical issues. That seems to me like a social obligation that we have, but single payer doesn't seem like it's going to solve that problem. And it also doesn't seem like it's going to, or maybe it would mitigate that problem, but cause lots and lots of other serious problems along the way. So I'm actually kind of heartened by what I call sort of third way approaches, or, and this is actually maybe like another project later down the road, but, concierge medicine has been a kind of interesting shift in recent years, where it used to be, you'd basically, rich people would have like a doctor on retainer, right? So they wouldn't have to deal with like what, middle class plebes like us have to do, which is call the doctor's office and wait 2 weeks for an appointment or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're finding concierge medicine is actually expanding into low income areas. It's expanding into specialist areas. And it's actually become a way for physicians to get around the massive bureaucracy that has made physician burnout such a problem. And so it's better for physicians, and it's also better for patients because you get a dedicated physician. You can call at any time. You don't have to deal with like this bureaucracy of making sure that you have prior approval and making sure that your insurance covers it and all this kind of stuff. So I'm actually like, there's these interesting innovations on the margins that I think are really fascinating. I don't think concierge medicine is the solution by any stretch, but there's interesting innovations happening, which I think are going to cause, like sort of cracks that we can maybe widen and open up some more freedom in the system for people to do more interesting, innovative work. Right now, the system is so bureaucratic that people they drown before they can get their head above water, right? Like both patients and providers are stuck in this very, very bureaucratic system with terrible incentives, and that really pushes us toward very high intensive medical care. And that's usually not the best kind of care that you want. So that's kind of the gist of the book. I do have a chapter at the end on sort of possible areas of reform, but I can't say that I walked away from that book like optimistic. I think the bureaucracy surrounding American healthcare is so entrenched and so huge that I'm not sure we have any decent solutions in the short term, other than just, if you can opt out, try to find some sort of, third way option, and maybe somebody will do something interesting when we really reach a crisis point. But I'm not sure what that looks like. So
yeah, cheap bus lines to Mexico, I guess, or something
yeah,
for our because when I took care of my grandfather when he was diagnosed with cancer, and it was sort of what you're talking about. The system, it was like crushing, dealing with just all the bureaucracy and whatnot. And I mean, my grandfather would not have undergone the treatment he did if he had known how it would not have been successful, and sort of a just prolonged and uncomfortable year of life. And I think have you written, or is there a chapter in the book on like the culture surrounding like our view of death? Because to me, I've thought a lot about that since then. I mean, I know like there's some transhumanist people who are like, death needs to be classified as a disability. So even more medicalizing it, I suppose. And like when my grandfather did pass away, which was similar in home hospice and everything, when the funeral home came to get him, they're like, oh, why don't you, like, they made us all leave the room, you know?
Hmm.
And I, uh, did research after that and was stunned to learn that home funerals and like home burials are actually legal almost everywhere. I mean, the
Yeah.
main thing is easements for burying people on your property, but it's sort of like, to me, it's like when I go, I would like my family to just take care of all that because I think it'd be healthy for them. What are your thoughts on all that sort of?
Yeah, well, this is actually it is part of the book. So in the chapter on death, I interview a bunch of palliative care physicians and hospice nurses and hospice directors, but also a couple, oncologists and critical care folks, because I wanted to see sort of the full kind of, how physicians and practitioners and nurses really think about this problem. And what I found was pretty interesting. I mean, I know there's a deep frustration in the palliative care community. And my sister is a palliative care nurse practitioner. And so I got a lot of insight from her. She works in a hospital. She talks to dying people as her job every day. And one of the things that she finds really deeply frustrating is that there's a kind of hesitation, even within the medical community, to admit when people are dying.
Mhm.
And so there's like people don't say the word. They try to avoid talking to patients about um what's going to happen in 6 months. It's here's what the next 3 weeks look like, or here's what the next week looks like, or here's what the next 2 days look like. And it takes a pretty educated patient to say, well, wait a second, am I going to be here in 6 months? If I'm not going to be here in 6 months, then what I think about the next 3 weeks should be different, right?
Mhm.
If I'm going to be here in 6 months, then yeah, let's talk about the next 3 weeks, right? And let's see what like that quality of life can look like. And but the frustration that I think a lot of palliative care physicians and nurse practitioners and other people who work in this space, hospice nurses, is that patients often don't find out that they're terminal until it's too late to do the kinds of things that they might want to do with that time. And they don't find out that they're terminal, not because nobody knows, but because nobody will admit it to them. And
Mhm.
so oncologists are particularly guilty of this, and I think some of it has to do with the incentives within oncology as a discipline, but also I think it has to do with the psychological um, sort of reality of being an oncologist, which is that if people die, you feel like a failure, right? Like it's
Mhm.
actually deeply painful, I think, for a lot of doctors to lose people that they've worked closely with. But a lot of people will die. And so you've got to give those people the time and the space to think about how they want to spend the limited time that they have left. Sometimes you can't do that, right? Like sometimes the disease is such that you just can't do that. And that's a different problem. But I do think that the medical establishment's discomfort with death is sort of related to the overall cultural discomfort with death. And one of the things that I was trying to sort of do a little bit of once the book was published is just really encourage people. Like I've laid out my final wishes with my husband and my sister and my parents. Because part of the problem that you run into is that because people are really hesitant to talk about death, you get a lot of familial discord at the end of life
Yes.
because
Yeah.
people haven't made their wishes clear. You get, a sister who loves somebody, and you get the husband who loves somebody, and you get a parent who loves somebody. And all of those people have different visions of how this should go. And that means then that you're actually spending the last week or so of someone's life wrangling over stuff when you should be spending time with this person. And you should, everyone should just be coming together to figure out how to grieve and mourn and celebrate this life, right? That's leaving the world. And so because we're uncomfortable talking about it, we're really unprepared when it actually happens. And so I do, like I do think people should think about like there was a cool TED talk about mushroom shrouds. I'm all about mushroom shrouds. Like wrap me in this like shroud of mushroom things, and I'll just go back to the earth in like 2 weeks. It'll be great. I think about this a lot just because of the work I had to do for the book. I mean, it was like 5 years that I was sort of thinking deeply about both
Yeah.
birth and death. But I think I've come out of it in a much more positive place, which is that it's going to happen at some point, right? I don't know. I hope it happens later rather than sooner. But I also really hope that I can work with my family and prepare them so that it doesn't have to be a complete and utter catastrophe for them, psychologically, emotionally. And that, we can spend whatever quality time we have at the end together. But we don't make it easy. So like as a culture, we don't make it easy. And a lot of this too, the media doesn't help this either. So there's almost no media portrayals of normal physiological birth or death. Like if you look at like Grey's Anatomy, or, someone could write a really interesting paper on this, maybe someone already has, but like media portrayals of death are always like ICU, or like an ambulance is involved, or like it's like always some sort of like catastrophe. And media portrayals of birth are similar, right? It's always a horrifying, like, home birth gone wrong that then ends up in a transfer to a hospital, or somebody is, or it's a C-section or whatever. And we don't have a lot of role models for how to give birth and die. And what's interesting is that that's actually how like primates in particular, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. I have a small child home and she's mad at the iPad. But if you look at, for example, how primates, for example, learn how to give birth successfully, they experience it by watching their older siblings or their mothers, right, go through this process. And then they learn how to do it. And then they learn how to take care of their infant. And so if you have very high rates of infant abandonment in, for example, gorillas or orangutans who haven't been able to watch how other members of their species do this. And humans are similar. So if you've never seen somebody give birth without being hooked up to every machine imaginable or automatically getting a C-section, well, you're not going to be able to, it's going to be really, really hard to do it in a different way. So we just culturally, I think we're really uncomfortable with these normal physiological processes, partly because they involve pain, which we're kind of uncomfortable with as a society. Like we don't like pain. I don't think we have a good attitude toward pain, that like meaningful pain. I'm not saying that people should be in pain in like other kinds of ways, but some kind of pain actually does have meaning to it. And we're sort of like weirdly uncomfortable talking about that. So yeah, I think there's a lot that's bound up in this. And we're not good at having these conversations. And yeah, it means that people don't know what options are available. And so, yeah, you end up with like a funeral director kicking everyone out of your living room, which is not really like it's not necessary,
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that altered how I look at this sort of a lot is in the screw tape letters when World War II starts and the young demon is like, oh great, isn't this awesome? This giant war is happening, and screw tape is like, well, yeah, but also no, because in a war people are dying, but they're dying like doing all these good things, serving other people, doing heroic things. And he's like, it's so much better when they die when they're really old and everyone's lying to them in the hospital bed, basically. And it's like, it's much easier to get them then. And I that really altered how I thought about all that. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book by Jessica Zitter, who is she was a critical care, like an emergency room doctor before she switched into palliative care. And she has a couple sort of nice narratives. I mean, they're really depressing, but it's sort of it's that exact same thing, right? Which is that hospitals focus so much on the next thing to do to this person's body. Like, what's the next thing that we inject? What's the next action? That nobody ever stops to think like, what, this is a human being. Like, what are we like, what's happening in the last hour or two of this person's life that they might need to sort of like have just 4 seconds to think about, right? And then she has this really, I mean, the wake up moment for her was as a resident, where she was doing CPR on a corpse, because the hospital protocol was like, it was this terminally ill person who had died, and the residents continued doing CPR on this dead body for like 20 minutes because that
Wow.
was just the protocol, right? They didn't have a DNR. They didn't, like, you just keep
Mhm.
pumping. And she was like, I am giving CPR to a corpse. This cannot be what medicine
Yeah.
means, right? So there is something very Screwtapian about
Yeah. So sort of very related to that, but we're running out of time. But I wanted to talk about your new project, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life, which I think is going to be great. So it's a Substack that you're launching that's supposed to help form a book. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's actually been a book project-ish for the last couple years, but I've had tons of other reasons. Like, it's really aimed at a general audience, and I had a ton of scholarly projects that were kind of taking precedence. And now I've kind of cleared the decks with some scholarly stuff and actually have time to focus on it. So I'm really excited. I finally feel like I have the bandwidth to do it. And so I started the blog. It was on WordPress before, and I blogged for a while, but then kind of fell off because just other stuff kind of happened. So now I'm recommitting, and I also got a really nice grant from the Mercatus Center's Center for Pluralism, and I'm going to screw it up, but like Pluralism and Civil Society or something. And so they're supporting the book with some research assistant funding, which is great. So yeah, the Substack is essentially sort of an opportunity for me to trial some ideas and see where they go before I lay out a more formal argument in the book itself. But I have a couple chapters sort of drafted of the book, and then I'm going to work through some things and some case studies on the Substack. But it's been a fun project because I get to use a lot of stuff that I do in class with students that I don't really use in my scholarly research. And so there's all sorts of like news media case studies and stuff that are fun and I think highlight some interesting immoderate impulses in our modern culture. So it
Yeah,
should be
and
fun.
your recent post on moderation in religion, I thought was really great. Uh, Particularly, you mention confession and reconciliation as being, um, you know, very important aspects of religion. And it is something that seems to be completely absent um, in today's broader society. We can't, someone messes up, someone said something dumb 10 years ago on Twitter, hunt them down. And I don't even know what the end goal is, but express outrage. So I think that's something that's quite relevant. And then your other point where you talk about humble discernment, and also your tips basically for both religious people and atheists, I think, are quite relevant. Uh, yeah, so I just wanted to talk on that before we end.
Yeah. So this is actually, I've been thinking about this more. I converted to Catholicism in 2019 after a long period of God sort of poking me in various ways. But I grew up atheist. My parents are Zen Buddhists. I grew up actually going to a Zen Buddhist Sunday school.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it was
I
very
didn't know
weird.
those were things.
Yes, well, it was yeah. There was a lot of contention actually within the Zen Center on whether we should have a sort of religious school, given that it's not really a religion, and everyone was sort of split on this point. But so I feel like I've experienced both sides of the coin, which I think allows me to think, you know, about sort of how people think about and talk about religion, because for a big part of my life, I was actually pretty dismissive of religious belief. I was dismissive of sincere religious belief. I thought most, religious folks were hypocrites. I had a very uncomfortable relationship with my born again Christian grandmother, which always sort of colored my thinking about Christianity itself as a religion. So what's been kind of interesting since, since my conversion, is trying to think about, or really actually just being confronted with a lot of these religious ideas in from within the religious context, right? And that's where, like, I think my thinking about reconciliation really grows out of, and this actually relates back to the Beckhoff and Pierce book, because even in animal societies, the process of reconciliation is absolutely essential. That's how, for example, if there's some sort of fight or something within a coyote group or within a wolf pack or within a chimp group, the two sides have to come together. They have to reconcile. There has to be a pulling back together. And in fact, and Franz de Waal actually talks about this in his book, Chimpanzee Politics, too, about how agitated chimps will get if they're denied the ability to reconcile. They actually get like physically anxious, and they start getting more and more agitated. And you see this with kids too, right? So like kids, after they've like whacked you because they're having a temper tantrum, they want to come hug you. They have this need for physical connection, reconnection. And so it strikes me that confession is a really natural human desire, in the sense that it's a way of reconciling yourself with somebody, in this case your relationship with God that you've harmed. But we do it all the time in lots of other contexts. But I think you're absolutely right that like the Twitter kind of mobs and all these other like we've made it really hard for people to come back together. And you're also coming back together, it's not really a real relationship, right? So like Twitter comes after you, you're not quite sure who you're apologizing to, like who am I making this right with? Like there's no existing relationship. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. And also whatever it might have been happened 20 years ago, what am I supposed to do here? I apologize if you can hear the meltdown in the background. So speaking of reconciliation, but yeah, so I think it's, there's a lot of stuff about religious belief and religious practices that seem kind of alien if you're looking at it from the perspective of like, wait, I'm talking to God through a priest, and then the priest like magically forgives all my sins. Like that's just sprinkling fairy dust. But if you look at it from the deeply human perspective of this is what you need to sort of repair the relationship, and this is the process that we do it, and here's the accountability that we build in, right? We make you go somewhere and do it in front of another person so that you're not just like letting yourself off the hook at night when you're like, sorry God, I did X, Y, or Z, I'll be better, right? There's a kind of accountability built in. And it's kind of funny too. I read a lot of productivity literature, and I was a coach for a while for early stage faculty, and a lot of the processes are really similar. Like it's about creating accountability. It's about making sure that you're being transparent, doing weekly reviews, all this kind of stuff. Like the examined prayer is very similar to a weekly accountability check-in. Like it's not that foreign, right?
Yeah, I was raised evangelical. I mean, I went to private Christian schools the whole time, and non-sacramental, and I'm now Anglo-Catholic. And I've never done auricular confession, which is something my church does offer, but the corporate confession before Eucharist every week, I find so, yes, just refreshing. And because we do it, it's long and drawn out. And even after we confess, we say, still not worthy, still have, messed up so much. But yeah, the other point, are you familiar with the terms cage stage?
No.
So it applies to really any ideology that people convert to, but I find it so useful for uh, uh, understanding why people are doing things. But I first heard it used in terms of cage stage Calvinists, but I know tons of cage stage Catholics and cage stage Orthodox. The joke is after someone converts, you need to lock them in a cage for a few years because they're so zealous and immoderate, one might say, in their approach because they're joining something new and everything. And I just thought that your points on advice touches on that. But we're out of time, but maybe we can talk about that in the future. Thank you so much, Dr. Lauren Hall, for being on with us today. I think this was an awesome conversation that I think lots of people will get a lot out of and have new avenues to explore. So thanks so much.
Thanks. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Republic of Azo. Be sure to subscribe and check out all the links in the description below. Thanks, and have a great day.